Okay, so you're here because you want to understand something really important, right? And that's how to actually build wealth.
Yeah,
But there's so much information out there.
there is.
It's overwhelming, right? So we're doing a deep dive today into how wealth is built, and we're going to look at the characteristics and habits of millionaires.
That's right.
And what's really interesting is we've got all these insights that we've pulled from years of research, and we're going to use this book, The Millionaire Next Door by Thomas J. Stanley and William D. Danko,
Right.
as our primary guide for today's deep dive. And
But
this book, it's not just like some online poll you take in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
It's years of surveys and interviews with self-made millionaires and the people who advise them.
Right.
And
Yeah.
and they ask this really interesting question, like,
Mm.
how do regular people become wealthy,
Yeah.
in one generation?
Yeah.
And why doesn't a high income automatically mean you're going to be wealthy?
Right.
So, okay, right off the bat, I'm going to ask you, because we all have this image in our head of a millionaire, right?
Right.
And it's like fancy cars and private jets and
Dream vacation.
champagne and caviar, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like we have this image in our heads.
Absolutely.
But what's interesting about this book is they completely flip that on its head, right?
They totally do. Yeah. I think a lot of people would be very surprised to learn about what millionaires are actually like.
And to clarify, so when we're talking about wealthy,
Right.
the book's definition is a net worth of $1 million or more,
Right.
not counting, like if you've got money tucked away in a trust account,
Yeah.
and they say about 3.5% of U.S. households meet that criteria. But what's really smart about this book is they focus on the 95% of millionaires with a net worth between 1 million and 10 million.
Yeah.
So it's a much more attainable level for us to understand.
Right. And I think that's a really important point.
Yeah.
This book isn't about billionaires or the ultra rich.
Uh-huh.
It's about how everyday people,
Right.
how they achieve financial independence.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we can all relate to.
Total.
More than,
Yeah.
a billionaire who just inherited all their money.
And it's not even just about hitting that $1 million mark, right?
Right.
It's about how your net worth stacks up against your income and other people your age.
Right, exactly.
And they give this example of Charles and Mrs. Bobbins.
Yeah.
Charles is a fireman.
Uh-huh.
Mrs. Bobbins is a secretary.
Okay.
So their combined income is $55,000 a year.
Okay.
So you think, okay, that's a comfortable middle-class life.
Yeah, for sure.
But their net worth was way higher than average for people their age and their income bracket.
Wow.
And what was fascinating about them is that they could have maintained their lifestyle for like a decade without any more income.
Wow.
Which is just amazing. And that's a real sign of wealth.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, to have that much financial security
Yeah.
is just incredible.
Okay, so now that we've kind of laid that foundation, let's get into some of the major discoveries of this research. And
Yeah.
they've got what they call the 7 factors that they consistently found
Ah.
among people who are good at building wealth. So
Okay.
what stood out to you from those?
Yeah, so, this book is based on so much data.
Yeah.
And they talk about, the typical millionaire.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting,
Yeah.
the picture that emerges is it's often someone who owns a business.
Yeah.
Maybe they own a local manufacturing plant or a chain of retail stores.
Okay.
And they've been living in the same town for a long time.
Mhm.
They're married. They've got kids.
Okay.
They live in a modest neighborhood,
Okay.
often alongside people who have, considerably less wealth than them.
Okay.
And they're really disciplined savers and investors, almost to the point of being obsessive. And perhaps surprisingly to some people,
Yeah.
80% of millionaires are first-generation rich.
Oh, wow.
So that means they built their wealth themselves.
So it's not about inheritance.
Right, exactly.
It's
It's about the choices you make,
Yeah.
the lifestyle you live,
Yeah.
and really, to taking control of your finances.
And that leads us to busting some of these myths that we have about millionaires, right?
Yeah,
absolutely. So they really challenge this idea of a millionaire as this big spender.
Right.
And they contrast this typical millionaire that we just described
Yeah.
with someone who you might automatically assume is wealthy, like a trust officer. And the trust officer spends a ton of money on really fancy clothes,
Okay.
designer watches, drives the latest import car, usually on a lease.
So they're kind of living that stereotypical
Yeah.
millionaire lifestyle.
And that's not what they found at all.
No, not at all. Most millionaires spend surprisingly little on things like suits.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
they said less than $400 for a
That's nice.
suit.
Like you said.
And only a tiny fraction
Right.
were buying those super expensive designer suits.
Yeah.
And the cars were really telling.
Yeah.
Most of them weren't driving those fancy foreign cars.
Right.
And they pretty much always own their vehicles outright rather than leasing them.
Okay. Yeah, and I think there's a reason for that.
Yeah. Why is that?
It's about
Yeah.
frugality. It's about being smart with their money.
Yeah.
And the book gives this great example. This guy named Johnny Lucas,
Okay.
who's a successful millionaire business owner,
Okay.
and he's not trying to impress clients with a lavish lifestyle.
Uh-huh.
In fact, he says it's more important for him to demonstrate careful financial management to his employees.
Okay.
He doesn't want to show up in a fancy car
Right.
and make them think he's wasting money. He wants to show them that he's responsible.
So it's almost like a cultural thing.
Yeah.
Of being responsible with money.
It's about setting an example.
Okay, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so another thing that I thought was super interesting was their research into
Yeah.
ancestry and wealth accumulation.
Yeah.
Because you would think that the people who immigrated to the U.S. early,
Right.
and they've had generations to build wealth,
Yeah.
they'd have the highest concentration of millionaires.
That's what you'd think, right?
But that's not what they found.
Nope.
So, for example, like the English ancestry group,
Uh-huh.
they were among the early arrivals,
Right.
but they only rank 4th
Wow.
in terms of millionaire concentration.
Interesting.
But you know who comes out on top?
I'm curious. Tell me.
The Scottish.
Really?
The Scottish.
Yeah.
They make up a tiny percentage of the total population,
Okay.
like 1.7% of households,
Uh-huh.
but they represent 9.3% of millionaire households.
Wow, that's huge.
So that means that people of Scottish ancestry are like 5 times more likely to be millionaires than you would expect,
Wow.
based on their population size.
That's amazing.
And almost 21% of Scottish ancestry households
Good.
have a net worth of $1 million or more.
That's wild.
So I'm thinking, okay, what's going on here?
Yeah, why is that?
Why are the Scottish so good at building wealth?
Well, the book dives into this.
Yeah.
And what they found is that it's not just about when they immigrated to the U.S.
Okay.
It seems like it has a lot to do with these deep-rooted
Okay.
cultural values around being frugal.
Okay.
They're very good at living below their means.
Okay.
They typically spend less than you'd predict based on their income level,
Oh, interesting.
which of course frees up a lot more money for saving and investing
Yeah.
over time. And the book even gives an example
Okay.
of a Scottish household earning $100,000 a year.
Oh.
But their typical spending was more like $85,000.
Okay.
So they're consistently saving $15,000
Yeah.
every year.
Which adds up.
Right. And that can make a huge difference
All right, well,
in the long run.
so even small, consistent things can make a
yeah.
big difference.
Yeah.
Okay, so another really interesting part of the book was about what happens to wealth when it's passed down through generations.
Oh, yeah.
And they talk about this concept of Americanization.
Yeah.
So they tell the story of Victor,
Okay.
who is this classic example of a thrifty, first-generation American entrepreneur.
Uh-huh.
So he embodies this strong immigrant work ethic,
Yeah.
very frugal.
Right.
But here's the surprising thing. His well-educated kids
Okay.
adopted a much more consumer-driven lifestyle.
Oh, wow.
So they call them under-accumulators of wealth, or UAWs,
Okay.
which just means they're not building wealth in line with their income.
Right.
So for Victor's kids, having a more comfortable life meant more material possessions, but not necessarily the same financial discipline that their dad had.
Oh, interesting.
And that's where this idea of Americanization comes in.
Yeah.
Like those habits of thrift can erode as you become more integrated into this American consumer culture.
That's right. And you see this happening with a lot of immigrant groups.
Yeah.
Within 1 or 2 generations, they shift
Yeah.
towards that American normal range of consumption.
Yeah.
And, that highlights why these new waves of immigrants
Yeah.
are so important. They
Yeah.
bring that
Yeah.
strong work ethic and
Yeah.
that frugality.
Yeah.
And that can really contribute to wealth creation in the economy.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about habits,
Yes.
but the book keeps going back to this idea of frugality as being so important. Like,
Yeah.
they basically say frugal, frugal, frugal.
Right.
And they share this story about interviewing some decamillionaires. So people worth $10 million or more. And even they were surprised by how frugal these people were in their daily lives.
That's fascinating.
Like, the typical American millionaire in their study never spent more than $399 on a suit.
Okay.
And half of them spent even less.
Wow.
So we're not talking about people who are constantly splurging on luxury.
Yeah, it really challenges that
Yeah.
stereotype of the
It's
millionaire who's always, buying expensive things.
To illustrate this, they talk about a very specific profession,
Okay.
and that's auctioneers.
Oh, interesting.
And you wouldn't think that being an auctioneer is like a guaranteed path to wealth, especially because their income can fluctuate. But they found that millionaire auctioneers actually embody this principle of frugality leading to wealth.
Oh.
So they're often younger than millionaires in like urban or suburban areas.
Okay.
They spend a lot less on housing,
Uh-huh.
and they're less likely to own expensive foreign cars. Oh, okay.
And they hold more of their wealth in assets that are going to appreciate in value.
Oh, okay. So they're thinking about the long term.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is they say that a lot of these auctioneers
Yeah.
have experience with bankruptcy.
Okay.
So they've seen firsthand
Right.
what happens to the value of those consumer goods when people go bankrupt.
Yeah,
And that
yeah.
seems to have made them really averse to overspending
Oh, wow. That makes sense.
on things that lose value quickly.
Yeah.
So they talk with this woman, Mrs. Rule.
Okay.
She's an auctioneer.
Okay.
Her average income is around $90,000.
Okay.
But her net worth is over $2 million.
Wow. That's incredible.
And it's all thanks to her financial planning and budgeting.
Wow.
And she does all of her finances with just 2 credit cards.
Okay.
They contrast her with this couple, Robert and Judy. They make $200,000 a year.
Wow. Okay.
So more than double Mrs. Rule's income,
Right.
but they have a lot less wealth.
And they feel totally controlled by their spending habits.
Oh, no.
And get this, they have 14 credit cards.
Oh, my goodness.
So it's really not about how much you make.
Right.
It's about how you manage your money.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so let's go back to this
Sure.
idea of an underaccumulator of wealth, or UAW.
Okay.
So they introduce this guy, Mr. Friend.
Yeah.
He has a high income,
Uh-huh.
but he grew up in a modest family.
Okay.
But his parents, even though they didn't have a lot of money,
Yeah.
they prioritized spending over saving.
Oh.
So even though he was making more money than his parents, he kind of inherited their spending habits. So he's always trying to keep up with his social circle.
Yeah.
Like they call them the significant others.
Okay.
And so he's spending a lot of money to project a certain image.
Okay.
And this is really hurting him in the long run.
Yeah, I could see how that would
Yeah.
catch up to you.
So he's nearly 50. And he figures he could only live off his savings for about a year
Wow.
if he had to stop working.
That's scary.
And he's going to have a lot of trouble retiring comfortably.
Yeah.
And they say that for these UAWs to change,
Uh-huh.
they really need to want to change.
Right.
And they often need help from a professional, like a CPA,
Yeah.
who can help them with financial planning.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And they even talk about these cold turkey programs where you
Uh.
just like drastically cut back your spending.
Yeah, you got to get control of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is a huge wake-up call.
It is.
For anyone who feels like they're making good money,
Yeah.
but not getting ahead.
Right.
Okay, so another big factor that can affect wealth is income tax.
Yeah.
Right.
So for sure.
So it's the biggest annual expense for most households.
Yeah.
But here's the thing to remember. It's a tax on income,
Right.
not on your accumulated wealth.
Exactly.
And they make this really important distinction. Yeah.
Between people who have high incomes
Uh-huh.
and immediately spend it all
Okay.
versus millionaires who kind of deliberately realize a smaller percentage of their total wealth
Right.
as income
So they're not taking all of their money out
each year.
at once.
Yeah. But
Wow.
they give some crazy examples.
Okay, listening.
So there's this woman named Sharon.
Okay.
Her net worth is $370,000,
Okay.
but almost 60% of that is her annual income.
Oh, wow.
So it's all subject to tax.
Right.
Now compare that to Barbara. Her net worth is $3.5 million,
Okay.
but only 6% of that
Correct.
is realized as taxable income in a given year.
Wow, that's a big difference.
So Sharon ends up paying 19% of her net worth in income tax every year.
Oh, wow.
And Barbara only pays about 2%.
That's incredible.
Yeah. And the book even says that the typical American household
is paying 11.6% of their net worth in income tax, compared to like a billionaire who might pay less than 1%.
Wow.
It really makes you think differently about
Yes.
the advantages of building assets,
Right.
rather than just maximizing your income.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so here's another thing that I thought was really interesting. The book talks about how the neighborhood you live in
Okay.
can affect your ability to build wealth.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
actually makes a lot of sense.
So they say that living in these high-status neighborhoods
Yeah.
can actually make it harder to accumulate wealth.
Oh, why is that?
Because there's all this pressure
Yeah.
to keep up appearances
Right.
and live a certain lifestyle.
Okay.
And so you end up spending more
Yeah.
and having less to save and invest.
Yeah, it's like keeping up with the Joneses,
Totally.
but on a
yeah.
much grander scale.
And they say that even millionaires who live in these really fancy areas, they realize a much smaller percentage of their wealth as income
Right.
compared to their neighbors who are less wealthy and who might be spending a ton to try to keep up.
To try to fit in.
Yeah. And so they say people who become really wealthy, they buy those expensive houses after they've made their money.
Yeah.
Not before.
Right.
So don't buy into that expensive neighborhood
Yeah.
too early.
Yeah, it can trap you in a cycle of spending.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the differences between people who are good at building wealth and those who aren't.
Yeah.
And the book refers to these groups as PAWs,
Okay.
which stands for Prodigious Accumulators of Wealth.
Okay.
And then there's the UAWs, who are the underaccumulators of wealth.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, they actually looked at the fears and worries of these two different groups.
Okay.
And they found that the UAWs, despite having these really high incomes, they worry more about things like not being able to retire
Yeah.
or never being able to accumulate enough wealth
Wow.
compared to the PAWs.
Right.
But here's the thing. They actually spend less time
Wow.
planning and budgeting.
Oh, that's...
And then the PAWs saver.
Right.
So there's this disconnect there.
Yeah, there is.
And they give these examples of these two doctors, Dr. South and Dr. North.
Okay.
And they have similar incomes,
Okay.
but very different levels of wealth.
Uh-huh.
So Dr. North is the PAW,
Okay.
and he says he has low levels of concern about his future finances and about being able to provide for his family.
Okay.
But Dr. South, the UAW, has moderate to high levels of concern in both of those areas.
So even though they're making the same amount of money, they have very different levels of security.
Totally.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Another really interesting thing that they challenge in this book is the assumption that you have to have a lot of education to be wealthy.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we all
kind of believe that.
We kind of believe that.
Yeah.
But they found some surprising stuff.
Okay.
So they give the example of Mr. Denzi, who's a PAW.
Okay.
And he was never really academic.
Okay.
And then there's Dr. Dokes, who's a UAW. And he was like the valedictorian of his high school class.
Wow. Okay.
Went on to earn advanced degrees.
Right.
But despite having similar incomes, Mr. Denzi had 5 to 6 times the net worth of Dr. Dokes.
That's a huge difference.
He had no debt.
So education doesn't necessarily equal wealth.
So they say that building wealth is actually blind to your level of education. And, you know, the authors even talk about their own experience in saying that even though they've had like 20 years of combined higher education, they weren't wealthy. And they also point out that a lot of professionals feel this pressure to look successful.
Right.
So they spend a lot of money on clothes and cars and houses, even if they don't really have the net worth to back it up.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so let's get back to those basic habits that the book keeps emphasizing, planning and budgeting.
Right.
So they say those are the key to controlling how much you spend and building wealth. And they give this great example, Dr. North of PAW.
Yeah.
He says that his family lives on a detailed annual budget and they stick to it.
Wow.
And then they ask Dr. South if he has a budget and he just says no.
Oh, wow.
And Dr. North has been saving and planning his finances since he was a kid.
Really?
Yeah.
That's impressive.
Since he was 11.
Wow.
And meanwhile, Dr. South admits to spending a crazy amount of money on clothes every year, like almost as much as the average American family's total annual income.
Oh, my goodness.
And when you look at the numbers, the Norths consistently spend way less on things like clothes and cars and club memberships.
Yeah, it really shows you the impact
Yeah.
of being intentional
Yeah.
about your spending.
Now, another really interesting thing that they talk about is the role of your spouse
Yeah.
in building wealth.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense.
Yeah, you're a team. You're a team.
Right.
So they say that your partner's attitude towards spending and saving and investing has a huge impact on your household's finances.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
And they talk about Dr. and Mrs. North.
Okay.
They both come from backgrounds that valued frugality.
Okay.
And they're both focused on being financially independent.
Okay.
And get this.
Yeah.
They only use one credit card.
Wow.
And it's just a plain Visa.
Okay.
Even though they're wealthy, they don't have those fancy department store cards.
Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah. For anyone who's struggling with budgeting, they introduced this CPA named Arthur Gifford,
Okay.
who helps people with their budgets.
Okay.
And he says that it's his wealthy clients who really want to track every single expense.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's like the more successful they are financially, the more they want to be on top of their money.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Okay, so let's talk about cars again, because I thought that was a really great example of how PAWs and UAWs think differently.
Right.
So they found that the Souths spent 6 times more on vehicles every year than the Norths.
Wow.
Yeah, and this included buying a $65,000 Porsche.
Oh, wow.
So Dr. South spent hours and hours negotiating for what he thought was the absolute lowest price on this brand new luxury car. And he spent like 60 hours a year doing this.
That's a lot of time.
Compared to Dr. North, who just buys used cars and maybe spends a couple hours on it every few years.
Wow.
So it's really about priorities, right?
Right.
One's focused on getting the best deal on this fancy car.
Yeah.
And the other one is thinking long term.
Yeah.
And minimizing how much they spend on something
Yeah.
that's going to lose value.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this difference extends to how they spend their time in other areas of their finances.
Okay.
So PAWs spend more time planning for the future and managing their investments.
Right.
While UAWs often feel like they're too busy
Right.
to deal with their finances.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that before.
Yeah.
People saying, I just don't have time to think about money.
But the book shows there's a strong correlation between planning your investments and actually accumulating wealth, and even among middle income earners.
Okay.
There's a big difference.
Yeah.